Hello, listeners, and welcome to Higher Level History. I'm Professor Carthel. This podcast is a companion to the American Yawp online textbook, and the idea is simple. Each episode, we step behind the chapter to find the stories worth telling. We're going to slow down on the moments worth slowing down on, follow the people the textbook can only mention in passing, and ask the questions that make history feel less like a subject and more like a story. Let's get into it. Chapter 10 of the American Yawp is called American Democracy, and it is really two chapters wearing one coat. The first half belongs to Andrew Jackson. You'll read about his chaotic cabinet, the Eaton affair, the war over the Bank of the United States, the nullification crisis, and the birth of the two-party system that would organize American politics right up to the eve of the Civil War. Then, about halfway through, the chapter turns. Jackson recedes, and you find yourself in the cotton fields of Mississippi, in the slave markets of New Orleans, in Texas, and in the revival tents of the Second Great Awakening. Before any of that, though, the chapter tells you exactly what it thinks the 1830s were. It is sitting right there in the opening paragraph, and most of you will read straight past it on your way to the story about the pistols that misfired. The Yawp describes a decade in which violence was a regular occurrence. Immigrants drew increased scrutiny, conspiracy theories ran wild, and partisan strains threatened the threads of American life. That's the whole chapter in a single sentence, and we're going to spend today testing it. Now, I want to be straight with you about something before we go any further. The most famous thing in this chapter is Nat Turner and the rebellion he led in Southampton County, Virginia, in August of 1831. It is the deadliest uprising of enslaved people in American history, and what the South did in response to it shaped everything that followed. You need to read that section very carefully, and you need to read what the Virginia legislators did afterward even more carefully than that. But we spent our last episode in Virginia. And I do not want to hand you two Virginia uprisings back to back, because the second one starts to sound like an echo of the first, and Nat Turner absolutely deserves better than that. So today, we're going to Massachusetts instead. We're going to a hill outside Boston on a summer night in 1834, where a crowd of working men burned down a girls' school. Then we're going to the courtroom where 12 of the 13 men arrested for it walked free, and to the legislator that spent the next 20 years refusing to pay for what was destroyed. Let me start with the building itself, because if you picture it wrong, nothing that follows will make any sense. It stood on a hill in Charlestown, Massachusetts, a few miles outside Boston, on ground the neighbors had taken to calling Mount Benedict. It was a handsome brick convent and boarding school run by the Ursuline Order, a community of Catholic nuns who had come down from Quebec by way of Ireland. From the upper windows, you could look across at Breed's Hill, where workmen were slowly raising a granite monument to the men who had fought and died there in 1775. The school had 47 students in the summer of 1834. 6 of them were Catholic. That number is the part almost everybody gets wrong. This was not an immigrant institution. The Ursuline sisters had built a school for the daughters of Boston's wealthy Protestant and Unitarian families who sent their girls there for the French, the music, and the manners, and who paid well for that privilege. To the working men of Charlestown, that arrangement looked like something worse than a Catholic school. It looked like the rich and the Catholics doing business with each other over the heads of everybody in between. Charlestown had about 10,000 people in it, and most of them were Protestant workers. There had already been trouble. Somebody killed one of the convent's dogs in 1829. Somebody burned its stable in 1830, and in 1833, a Protestant crowd tore apart an Irish bar in town. The fire did not come out of nowhere. Here's how it started. A young Episcopalian woman named Rebecca Reed had spent about 6 months at Mount Benedict, first as a charity student and then as a candidate to join the order, and then she left. She began telling people around Charlestown what she said she had seen inside, and she began writing it down. The stories were the standard ones that circulated about convents in those years, which is to say they were about locked doors, harsh penances, and young women who could not get out. Then, on the night of July 28, 1834, a nun walked out of the convent. Her name was Elizabeth Harrison, though inside the order she was Sister Mary John, and she taught music. She left the building after dark and made her way to a family living nearby, escorted by 2 Charlestown men who were known to dislike Catholics. The next day, Bishop Benedict Fenwick came out and spoke with her, and she went back. That is the entire incident. A woman had a difficult night, she left. She was persuaded to return, and she returned. By the time the newspapers were finished with it, there was a mysterious woman being held prisoner behind the walls of the convent on Mount Benedict, and half of Charlestown wanted to know what had been done with her. The rumor spread through the first week of August, and on the 10th, placards went up around town addressed to the selectmen, warning them to investigate the matter or find the nunnery demolished. And here's the part of this story I have the hardest time getting past. The investigation actually happened, and it worked. On Monday, August 11th, a group of Charlestown selectmen came up to the convent and asked to see the building. The Mother Superior let them in. Sister Mary John, the missing woman herself, walked them through the place personally and showed them whatever they wanted to see. On their way out, the students at the school heckled them from the windows, asking whether the gentleman had managed to find the prisoner. The selectmen went home and wrote up a statement for the newspapers. The woman was alive and well. She was free to leave whenever she liked. The convent was exactly what it claimed to be. The statement was scheduled to run the following morning. At around 8 o'clock that same evening, a crowd came up the hill and stepped outside the convent door, calling for the mysterious lady to be brought out. One of the sisters came to a window and asked them to go home. According to witnesses, the crowd looked up at her and offered her their protection. Then the Mother Superior came to the window and she was finished being polite. She told them that nobody in her house needed protecting and that everyone inside was already in bed. And then she said this.
The bishop has 20,000 of the vilest Irishmen at his command, and you may read your riot act till your throats are sore, but you'll not quell them.
The crowd went away, but 3 hours later, it came back. At around 11, somewhere between 50 and 60 men set fire to tar barrels on the convent grounds. The fire companies were called, and they came, and they looked at what was happening, and they decided not to intervene. Instead, they stood and watched with the spectators, and the crowd of spectators grew to about 2,000 people. There was nobody else to call. In 1834, there was not a professional police force in any city in the United States. The men broke the doors and the windows and went inside, and they began pulling the building apart. The nuns got the children out through the back of the house and hid them in the garden. At around midnight, the rioters set the buildings on fire, and within an hour or two, the school on Mount Benedict was gone. Before they left, they broke open the tomb where several of the sisters were buried. The nuns and 47 children walked through the dark to a house on Winter Hill and asked for shelter. The next night, the mob came back. By then, a militia company had been stationed around Boston, guarding the arsenal, the cathedral, the Catholic Church in Charlestown, and the house of one of the men who had escorted Sister Mary John out of the convent. Nobody was posted at the ruins. So the crowd went there, and they burned the fences and the orchards and the gardens. And when there was nothing left worth destroying, they went home. Boston's response, at first, looked like everything you would want it to look like. The mayor called a meeting at Faneuil Hall at 1 o'clock the following afternoon, and the city passed resolutions condemning the riot, appointed a committee to investigate it, and offered a reward for information. The Charlestown selectmen did the same thing. The outrage was loud, and as far as I can tell, most of it truly was sincere. Bishop Fenwick spent the same day doing something much harder. He called the Catholics of Boston together and told them to give up any thought of revenge, because revenge was incompatible with the religion they claimed. Then he learned that Irish workers were coming down by train from Lowell to settle the account themselves, and he sent priests out to intercept them on the road. Hold on to that one for a moment there. We've spent 9 episodes watching Americans reach for violence when the system failed them, and here is a man who saw it coming and put his hand out to stop it. Then the case went to court, and everything the city had been saying about itself stopped being true. 13 men were arrested, and 8 of them were charged with arson or burglary, which were capital crimes in Massachusetts. The first to be tried was John Buzzell, who had led the mob and had made no particular secret of it. The Attorney General asked for a delay because witnesses for the prosecution were receiving death threats. The trial went ahead anyway in December, and the jury deliberated for 21 hours and acquitted him. Buzzell later described the verdict himself. He said the testimony against him would have been enough to convict 20 men, but that somehow he had proved an alibi. 12 of the 13 defendants walked out of that courthouse. The one who did not was a 16-year-old boy who had gathered up the convent's books and burned them. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison at hard labor. And then something happened that I still find genuinely strange. Petitions began circulating to get the boy released, and one of them gathered 5,000 signatures in Boston. Among the people who signed it were Bishop Fenwick and the Mother Superior of the convent that had been destroyed. The governor pardoned him. So the only person punished for burning down a school full of children was a teenager, and the people whose home he helped burn were the ones who asked for his release. That leaves the money, and the money is the part that tells you what Massachusetts actually decided. Bishop Fenwick petitioned the legislature for compensation on January of 1835, arguing that the state had failed in its duty to protect private property. A committee agreed with him, and the resolution was crushed on the floor of the House by rural Protestant representatives. He came back in 1841, and in 1842, and in 1843 and 44, and it failed every time. In 1846, the legislature finally offered $10,000 against a loss the diocese put closer to $100,000, and the diocese refused it. The request came back in 1853, and then again in 1854, and it was defeated on both occasions. The state never paid. The ruins stayed on that hill for another 40 years. And in 1843, the granite monument on Breed's Hill was finally finished, so that for the rest of the century, you could stand in Charlestown and see both of them at the same time. We have spent this episode with a crowd that had decided it knew who really belonged in Massachusetts. For our special segment, which we're going to call The Vote at Mother Bethel, I want to take you to Philadelphia, into a room where 3,000 men answered that same question about themselves. James Forten was born free in Philadelphia in 1766, which made him 10 years old when the Declaration of Independence was read aloud in his very own hometown. His father died when he was young, and he went to work. At 14, he went to sea. He signed on to a privateer called the Royal Lewis under Captain Stephen Decatur, hunting British shipping for cargo and prize money. And before long, the Royal Lewis was captured by a British warship. This was a far more dangerous moment for him than it was for the rest of the crew. Black sailors taken off American ships were frequently sold into slavery in the West Indies, and everyone aboard understood that. Instead, the British captain took an interest in him. His name was John Beasley. He had a son about Fortin's age, and he offered to take the boy back to England and have him educated alongside his own child. Think about what that offer was really worth. A free black teenager in 1781 in a country that had not yet decided whether he was a citizen of anything was being handed an English education and a patron. Forten turned it down. What he said, as it came down through his family afterward, was that he had been taken prisoner for the liberties of his country and would never prove a traitor to her interests. Beasley sent him to the prison ship Jersey, anchored in New York Harbor, where thousands of American prisoners died over the course of the war. Forten survived it and came home. He apprenticed himself to a sailmaker named Robert Bridges, who had employed his father. He learned the trade, became the foreman of the loft, and bought the business outright when Bridges retired in 1798. Within a dozen years, it was one of the most successful sail lofts in Philadelphia, and Forten was one of the wealthiest men in the city of any color. He ran it his own way. He hired black workers and white workers and had them work side by side, and he refused to make or repair sails for any ship he believed was involved in the slave trade. When the British threatened Philadelphia in 1812, he helped raise a regiment of black volunteers to defend a city that would not let him vote. Which brings us to 1816, and to a very respectable idea. That year, a group of prominent white Americans founded the American Colonization Society. Their proposal was that free black Americans should be resettled in West Africa, and they made it sound like generosity. They talked about opportunity and dignity, and about a place where black Americans could govern themselves free from the prejudice that surrounded them here. And James Forten listened to it. So did Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Both men considered the plan seriously, and both of them began speaking in favor of it, because the country they had spent their entire lives serving had made a fairly convincing case that it did not want them. On January 15th, 1817, they called a meeting at Bethel Church in Philadelphia to bring the idea to the community. Roughly 3,000 men came, which was very nearly every adult black man in the city. They were tradesmen and dock workers and domestic servants, and they filled the pews and the aisles, and even the back of the room. James Forten stood at the front and called the meeting to order. Then he asked everyone in favor of colonization to say aye. Nobody said a word. He asked everyone opposed to say no, and the entire room answered him all at once. There is no record of a single dissenting voice. Now, the refusal is the part that gets quoted, and it deserves to be. But it is not the part that interests me the most. What interests me is that the wealthiest man in the room had walked in on the other side of the question, and he let 3,000 people who had far less than he did tell him he was wrong, and he believed them. Fortin spent the next 25 years fighting colonization. He wrote against it in the newspapers under the name A Colored Philadelphian. He put his own money into William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator and kept the paper alive during years when it could not pay for itself. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society never invited him to join. Membership was for white men only. When he died in 1842, about 5,000 people, black and white, lined the streets of Philadelphia for his funeral. At this point, I've given you a mob in Massachusetts and a meeting in Pennsylvania, separated by 17 years and 300 miles. So let me tell you why they belong in the same episode. Read chapter 10 all the way through, and you will notice how much of it is about removal. The obvious case is the one the chapter spends the most time on. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek were pushed off their land by federal law, by treaties negotiated with factions that did not speak for their nations, and by a Supreme Court ruling in their favor that the state of Georgia simply ignored. But removal was not one project in the 1830s. It was three, running at the same time, aimed at three different populations. Native nations were removed by law. Irish Catholics were pushed out by the mob in Charlestown and in a dozen other places over the 2 decades that followed. And free Black Americans were offered removal as a favor by a society of distinguished men on respectable letterhead, who described putting them on ships as an act of charity. Now look at what separates those three instruments. The Charlestown mob was the crudest of them, and it still worked, because nobody in Massachusetts had to defend a crowd of arsonists when 12 juries simply declined to convict them, and the legislators simply declined to pay. The Cherokee had the law and the courts on their side, and it did not save them. But colonization was the most effective of the three, and the reason is that it arrived with letters of reference. That is why it very nearly worked on James Fortin himself. It is easy to fight a mob, in the sense that you know exactly what it is. It is much harder to fight a kindness. There is one more thing in the Charlestown story that I do not want you to walk past. The men who burned that school were poor. They were laborers in a town of laborers, and they were correct that the wealthy families of Boston had no particular use for them. They were looking at an institution where rich Protestants paid Catholic nuns to educate their daughters, and they understood themselves to be standing outside an arrangement that had been made without them. Nothing in their situation changed after the fire. They were exactly as poor in 1835 as they had been in 1834. What they had instead was the knowledge that they were native-born and Protestant, and that whatever else was true of their lives, they were not the Irish. That was the compensation, and it cost the men who offered it nothing at all. So here is what these two stories share. Both of them turn on people who were completely certain they knew who somebody else really was. The crowd on Mount Benedict knew what went on behind convent walls. The American Colonization Society knew where free Black Americans belonged. The difference is that in Charlestown, There was nobody in the room to answer that certainty. In Philadelphia, there were 3,000 people, and they answered it in one syllable. No. When you read Chapter 10 of the American Yawp, you're going to spend most of your time in Washington, watching Jackson fight with his cabinet, his vice president, and his bank. Read that material carefully, as you always would, because the second party system that comes out of it is going to organize American politics for the next 20 years or so. But I want you to watch for 3 specific things. First, read the section on Nat Turner very carefully, and read what came after it even more so. Pay attention to the laws that followed and to what happened to Black churches and Black literacy in the South once the panic set in. Secondly, when you reach the paragraphs on nativism, you will find the convent burning described in 4 sentences. You now know what those 4 sentences contain, so ask yourself what else in that chapter is only 4 sentences long. And thirdly, watch the word removal every time it appears. Count how many different groups of people the chapter describes as being moved or pushed or invited to leave. Then ask who was doing it in each case, and what tool did they use, and which of those tools was the hardest to see clearly at the time. Chapter 10 of the American Yawp is available for free at americanyawp.com. Read it alongside this episode, not instead of it. I'm Professor Carthel, and this has been Higher Level History. That wraps up this episode of Higher Level History with Professor Carthel. Don't forget to check the episode description for full music and sound clip licensing information. If you have any questions or simply want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me at prof.carthel@higherlevelhistory.com. And if you haven't already, head over to theamericanyawp.com to access your free online copy of the American Yawp textbook. The podcast and the textbook work best together. Higher Level History is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with any academic institution. Until next time, I'm Professor Carthel.